Hi, this is Dr. E again, and welcome to the third biology video notes. In the last video notes, we started talking about the characteristics of life. We talked about three of those characteristics. One, obtain and use energy. Two, growth and development. And three, reproduction. In today's video notes, we're going to talk about a couple of more characteristics of life. The first one we're going to talk about today is all living things are composed of one or more cells. Okay, cells are the smallest unit that can carry out all the functions of life. Therefore, the smallest possible living thing is only one cell, but not smaller than that. The cells are the basic structural, functional, and reproductive unit of life. So let's take that definition apart a little bit. Let's start with the reproductive unit of life. Why? Well, in sexual reproduction, one cell, the sperm cell, unites with another cell, the egg cell, to form the first cell of the new organism, the zygote. And that cell begins to divide by mitosis to create the rest of the new organism. So we can clearly see that reproduction and sexual reproduction is at the cell level in its most basic form. What about asexual reproduction? Well, in asexual reproduction, one cell splits into two cells, and now you have two new organisms. So again, the cell is the basic unit of reproduction. How is the cell the basic unit of structure? Well, it is the basic unit of structure because it's the building blocks of all living things. Just like a brick house is made up of bricks organized in a certain way, living things are made up of cells organized in a certain way. The most difficult concept is cells are the basic functional unit of life. When we look at ourselves, it's hard to see that. However, when we look carefully or observe carefully, we see that it is the cell that is breaking down food molecules to release energy so that we can carry out activities. We also see that it's within the cell that proteins are made that give us our appearance, that give us our structure. We also see the cells producing proteins that send signals to other parts of our body, for example, hormones. We can also see cells making proteins that protect our bodies from foreign invaders, such as antibodies. So we can start to see that it's at the cell level that most of our functions are carried out. We can divide cells based on how many cells are in an organism. So we could have unicellular organisms, which are only made up of one cell. When you are a unicellular organism, that one cell has to carry out all the functions of life. So it's a very generalized cell. Multicellular organisms are organisms made up of more than one cell. So they can have a division of labor, meaning that each cell can be designated to do a specific function. So, in other words, different cells are specialized to carry out different functions. So, for example, muscle cells are responsible for moving the organism, Bone cells are responsible for supporting the organism. Nerve cells are responsible for sending signals throughout the organism. And skin cells are responsible for preventing foreign objects from entering the organism. So in a multicellular organism, each cell is not responsible for carrying out all the functions like in a unicellular organism. All right, the next characteristic of life that we want to look at is all living things have different levels of organization. For example, they have molecular organization. What this means is atoms bond together to organize into small molecules. These small molecules organize into bigger, more complex molecules. Cells are made up of complex molecules that are organized to form organelles. Organelles are the small structures within a cell that carry out functions. And these organelles within the cell are arranged in a way to be able to carry out the activities of life. Thus, we go from molecular organization to cellular organization. Cells are then organized together to form tissues, which are organized together to form organs, which are organized to form organ systems within the organism. So we see these different levels of organization. And remember, to maintain this arrangement or this organization requires energy. The next characteristic of life is all organisms respond to their environment. So let's define two terms. The first term, stimulus. Stimulus is anything that causes a living thing to react. It could be temperature, it could be sound, it could be light, it could be odor, and a host of many other factors. Response is a reaction to the stimulus, and this reaction or response is usually in a way that increases the chances of the survival of the organism. So, for example, if I place my hand on a hot stove, I go, ouch, right? So, the stimulus is the hot stove. The response is me pulling my hand away from the stove. If I keep my hand on the stove, my hand burns, gets destroyed, and that does not help my chances of survival. So the response actually increases my chances for survival. A very important type of responding to stimulus is homeostasis. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a constant internal environment in response to environmental changes. You can have a change in temperature outside. It can get very cold, but your body temperature remains at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit. It can get very hot outside, but your body temperature again remains at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit. Maintaining homeostasis is maintaining conditions inside your body at optimal levels for survival. So you want to keep your temperature at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit. You also want to maintain pH at approximately 7.2. You want to maintain your water balance. You want to maintain your blood pressure. You want to maintain your blood sugar. The next characteristic of life is all living things adapt and evolve. Adaptation is any hereditary, and let me emphasize the word hereditary. If it's not an inherited trait, it's not an adaptation. So again, adaptation is any hereditary changes in structure, behavior, or internal process that increases the survival advantage of an organism in a particular environment. Adaptation leads to a population well suited to survive in a particular environment. An example of that would be a polar bear. Polar bear has white fur for camouflage against the white snow. It also has the fur to keep it warm, and it also has a lot of fat underneath the fur to keep it warm. So it's well adapted for its environment. Gradual accumulation of adaptations is evolution. Right? How does adaptation occur? Well, within a population, there's a huge amount of variation. We know that a lot of that variation comes from sexual reproduction. It also comes from mutations. In that population, there's a competition for limited resources. There's competition for shelter, there's competition for food, there's competition for water. This leads to survival and more reproduction by those with a variation that provides a survival advantage. Some people call this survival of the fittest. Traits that positively affect survival are more likely to reproduce and pass those traits on to the next generation. The traits become more and more common in that population. The next trait, or not trait, characteristics of living things, is all living things demonstrate heredity. What is heredity? Heredity is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. All living things have a set of instructions. Those set of instructions are DNA. DNA determines what an organism will be like. These instructions are passed to offspring during reproduction. DNA is divided up into sections. These sections are referred to as genes, and each genes are instructions for a particular trait. The DNA itself is a long molecule, and that molecule is wrapped around proteins. The combination of this long DNA molecule wrapped around proteins, the structure is located in the nucleus and is known as the chromosome. Lastly, the instructions in DNA are instructions for making proteins, and it's the proteins that provide our appearance and carry out our activities. The last characteristic of life is living things interact with their environment. The bottom line is living things cannot live in isolation. Living things depend on living and non-living things for their existence. Thank you and have a good night.